All right, welcome back. This is Did Syd Barrett, Dark Side of the Moon, Part 2. And in this episode, I would like to discuss some of the context and influences of the topics that we had previously discussed in Part 1. This is going to be largely literary, so it's going to be pretty dry. Some folks really love discussing poetry and literature, so perhaps it'll be interesting to them. And I do promise to try and make it interesting for pretty much everyone else as well as I can. So, what I'd like to do then is start off with corrections. We normally start off with corrections, and I'd like to point out two, which are that Sadarshana and Trudy Hughes found the two quotes that I had requested. So, the song "Money" states has the line about "it's a gas." And I had said, I read somewhere that Mr. Barrett had said life's a gas, and that was located, so that's a direct correlation with the metaphor use. And the second was that in the song Time, the phrase wasting the hours in an offhand way, and then offhand I recall reading that Mr. Barrett had mentioned stating that perhaps getting released from the band was just being a bit offhanded about things, and that was located as well. So thank you both. You saved me time and effort, which is nice because there's a lot of work that goes into each one of these, and I guess sometimes I get kind of burnt out on it. So it's nice to have people that help me put things together. So thank you. That helped me out quite a bit. Now, what I wanted to discuss was Thoreau, John Clare, and William Blake, and I'm going to get to each one of these in turn. No particular order. I've organized them based on thoughts and how I want to kind of finish things up. But what I want to start with is a poet, John Donne, as suggested by Renewed Poet. And he mentions, of course, that the idea of "for whom the bell tolls" may not just be a reference to Mr. Hemingway, but may in fact be a reference to John Donne the poet. Now, John Donne the poet, born in January of 1572, died in March of 1631, and he spent some time working as a cleric, and I believe he was a soldier for a short period of time. He wrote a poem that many people probably know, which is "Death Be Not Proud," and perhaps I'll put that here on the screen. I won't necessarily run through that here. The reason I would like to discuss him, of course, is that he does have a poem that is from his Devotions upon Emergent Occasions, which is Meditation 17. So I want to take a look at that really quick, and let's try to figure out exactly what is the general feel or the theme of that specific poem. So I'll kind of read it at you, and hopefully it won't be too dry. But let's take a look at it. Now, if you remember in the Pink Floyd song, the lyric is that far away across the field, there's a tolling of an iron bell, and it's calling people to their knees, etc., etc. So, what the intent of that is not really clearly stated, other than that there's a bell tolling for some reason, and it sounds like to call people to prayer. Now, Mr. John Donne was obviously a very religious man, and I guess there's an element of religion in most of his poetry. And just as a fair warning, quite a bit of this discussion is going to involve some aspects of religion, because almost every single one of these poets and writers that we're going to discuss was religious, and it really did weave itself into almost all of their work. So it's almost impossible really to discuss these guys without discussing religion. So let's look at the "No Man is an Island" part of the Meditation 17, written by John Donne. No man is an island entire of itself. Every man is a piece of the continent, a part of the main. If a clod be washed away by the sea, Europe is the less, as well as if a promontory were, as well as if a manor of thy friends or of thine own were. Any man's death diminishes me, because I am involved in mankind, and therefore never send to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. So, if that reference is in there, and it's referencing this particular meditation, one of the things that we really could kind of be trying to receive, or perhaps it's trying to be sent in the use of that particular line, is that we are all participating in humanity itself, and we are all related. And of course, that very concept is tied up in the song Us and Them from that same album. So you have to kind of wonder if that isn't on purpose, and if the spirit of that poem, that the idea of we're all tied together in life and we're all tied together in death and we're all part of humanity, isn't part of this album. And of course, we'll get back to that a little bit later on. I would argue that general sensation runs throughout this entire album, and is indeed within the very graphic that's used of on the cover of the album. And we'll get to that at the end of this episode. So that's pretty much it for John Donne. I would like to discuss Henry David Thoreau really quickly. And of course, I'm calling out Henry David Thoreau because of the idea that the idea of the English living lives of a quiet desperation. Quiet desperation is the English way, is the lyric, I believe, from the song. So we discussed before that is a Henry David Thoreau quote. Now, we didn't really discuss Thoreau much. He was a bit of a strange person. Again, he was a very moral person. I don't know, of these four that we're going to discuss, I don't know that I would call him to be overly religious compared to the other three. But he certainly was a very moral person. And for that reason, he decided to leave society. So he was alive from July 12, 1817 to May 6, 1862. And I'll just point out that the U.S. Civil War was from 1861 to 1865. And one of the things that we'll discover that Mr. Thoreau was very upset about was the nature of slavery in the southern United States. So I'm going to give you a few things from The Best of Walden and Civil Disobedience by Henry David Thoreau, Scholastic, Inc. Again, this is, I guess, 1939. So I'm just going to read a few things from here that may give us an inkling as to what Mr. Thoreau was all about. So just to start off with, page 11, when I wrote the following pages, or rather the bulk of them, I lived alone in the woods, a mile from any neighbor, in a house which I had built myself on the shore of Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts, and earned my living by the labor of my hands only. I lived there 2 years and 2 months. At present, I am a sojourner in civilized life again. So he went out into the woods, built himself a cabin, and lived there for a little over 2 years. What happened after that, I don't totally know. So why would he do such a thing? Well, page 13, bottom paragraph, kind of gives us a clue. He says, but men labor under a mistake. The better part of the man is soon plowed into the soil for compost. By a seeming fate, commonly called necessity, they are employed, as it says in an old book, laying up treasures which moth and rust will corrupt, and thieves break through and steal. It is a fool's life, as they will find when they get to the end of it, if not before. So in this way, he is describing the things that people are working for, and the idea that those things have value. In other words, acquiring things and spending your time, and before you know it, running out of time and spending a fool's life accumulating things that are not of value. What things then would be of value to Mr. Thoreau? Difficult to say. We'll get into that perhaps here in a little bit. Page 14, second paragraph. Some of you, we all know, are poor, find it hard to live, are sometimes, as it were, gasping for breath. I have no doubt that some of you who read this book are unable to pay for all the dinners which you have actually eaten, or for the coats and shoes which are fast wearing or are already worn out, and have come to this page to spend borrowed or stolen time, robbing your creditors of an hour. It is very evident that mean and sneaking lives many of you live, for my sight has been whetted by experience, always on the limits, trying to get into business and trying to get out of debt. So in this way, he is very specifically stating that the nature of life for many people is to be indebted and to endlessly seek to remove themselves from debt. On page 18, first paragraph, the greater part of what my neighbors call good, I believe in my soul to be bad. And if I repent of anything, it is very likely to be my good behavior. What demon possessed me that I behaved so well? You may say the wisest thing you can, old man, you who have lived 70 years, not without honor of a kind. I hear an irresistible voice which invites me away from all that. One generation abandons the enterprise of another like stranded vessels. So here he is discussing something that has repeatedly come up through generations of time, the idea of dissatisfaction with the way that previous generations have established the norms of life and expectations of life. The next paragraph, he mentions, this is the only way, we say, but there are as many ways as there can be drawn radii from one center. All change is a miracle to contemplate, but it is a miracle which is taking place every instant. Confucius said, to know that we know what we know, and that we do not know what we do not know, that is true knowledge. When one man has reduced a fact of the imagination to be a fact to his understanding, I foresee that all men will at length establish their lives on that very same. So I guess he's relaying the idea that he understands what is actually valuable. The bit there that concerns me, of course, is that he's quoting Confucius, which is a little bit surprising that this white man in the woods of Massachusetts in the late mid 1800s would be discussing Confucius. And you have to also kind of point out that it's interesting that other people like Alan Watts in the 1960s, 100 years later, would also be picking up on a lot of Eastern philosophy. On page 19, Mr. Thoreau tries to discuss what is really necessary in life. By the words necessary of life, I mean whatever of all that man obtains by his own exertions has been from the first, or from long use, has become so important to human life that few, if any, whether from savageness or poverty or philosophy, ever attempt to do without it. To many creatures there is in this sense but one necessary of life, food. So he discusses what exactly are the very, very necessary things in life, which include, of course, food. The implication being, of course, that many things in life are not necessary. And he does, of course, go on to say specifically that on page 21. Most of the luxuries and many of the so-called comforts of life are not only indispensable, but positive hindrances to the elevation of mankind. With respect to luxuries and comforts, the wisest have ever lived in a more simple and meager life than the poor. The ancient philosophers, Chinese, Hindu, Persian, and Greek, were a class than which none has been poor in outward riches, none so rich in inward. So in this way, he is describing the idea, of course, that possessions can rob a person of their inner life. Let's go ahead and move on. I guess I will point to page one. What is this? 105. Sorry, my eyesight's going kind of bad. So what I would like to point out here is the poetic ability of Mr. Thoreau in this description. Just listen to how he writes. This is a delicious evening when the whole body is one sense and imbibes delight through every pore. I go and come with a strange liberty in nature, a part of herself, as I walk along the stony shore of the pond in my shirt sleeves, though it is cool as well as cloudy and windy, and I see nothing special to attract me. All the elements are unusually congenial to me. The bullfrogs trump to usher in the night, and the note of the whippoorwill is borne on the rippling wind from over the water. Sympathy with the fluttering alder and poplar leaves almost takes away my breath, yet like the lake, my serenity is rippled but not ruffled. These small waves raised by the evening wind are as remote from storm as the smooth reflecting surface. Though it is now dark, the wind still blows and roars in the wood, the waves still dash, and some creatures lull the rest with their notes. He goes on to describe the woods in general, and I would just like to point out the inherent peace that he seems to be at in nature, and quite distant from other people. And perhaps in this way he also is relaying what is actually of value to him. I would like to contrast that with his poem on page 153. For people that don't believe me when I say that Mr. Barrett is of exceptional poetic ability, I would just like to point out that as we just heard from Mr. Thoreau, that was quite a bit of literature. He's obviously dexterous with words. He is intelligent and quite a good writer. But listen to his poetry. It is no dream of mine to ornament a line. I cannot come nearer to God in heaven than I live to Walden even. I am its stony shore, and the breeze that passes o'er. In the hollow of my hand are its water and its sand, and its deepest resort lies high in my thought. Some interesting sentiments related in that poem, but I think everyone would agree that's a bad poem. And I have a lot of respect for Mr. Thoreau, and I think he's a wonderful writer, but as a poet, he leaves quite a bit to be desired. Let's relay it that way. So, I suppose, I guess what I would like to end with then is kind of some of the background things of that were within Mr. Thoreau's mind, and to do that, I'll go to his discussion on civil disobedience. As you may or may not know, Mr. Thoreau was actually thrown in prison for a short period of time for refusing to pay a poll tax. He would not pay his taxes because he did not want to be funding a government that was doing things he did not agree with, such as allowing the existence of slavery. So let's see kind of what are some of the ideas that he presents. And of course, the Civil War would actually start just before Mr. Thoreau died, which was over the institution of slavery, largely. So on page 253, he says the following: I heartily accept the motto, that government is best which governs the least, and I should like to see it acted up to more rapidly and systematically. Carried out, it finally amounts to this, which also I believe, that government is best which governs not at all. And when men are prepared for it, that will be the kind of government which they will have. Government is at best but an expedient, but most governments are usually, and all governments are sometimes, inexpedient. Jumping ahead, he says, the standing army is only an arm of the standing government, the government itself, which is only the mode which the people have chosen to execute their will, is equally liable to be abused and perverted before the people can act through it. Witness the present Mexican War, the work of comparatively a few individuals, using the standing government as their tool, for in the outset the people would not have consented to this measure. The character inherent in the American people has done all that has been accomplished, and it would have done somewhat more if the government had not sometimes got in its way. For government is an expedient by which men would fain succeed in letting one another alone, and as has been said, when it is most expedient, the governed are most let alone by it. So he has quite a few ideas about government control. Obviously, I don't necessarily agree with everything that he has to say. It is a little bit funny to me that he went to prison so he wouldn't have to pay a poll tax because he didn't agree with slavery, but obviously the government eventually addressed the issue of slavery with the Civil War anyway. So perhaps he was a little bit ahead of his time, but the idea that the government wouldn't eventually, if it represented the people, come to terms with a problem like that, I guess that's his opinion, but it obviously didn't bear out historically, in my opinion. So there are a number of things that are kind of expressed by Thoreau, and we have to kind of wonder why he's being called out in the line about living a life of quiet desperation, and perhaps wanting to exit that to live a life of solitude. A very, very simple concept, but of course there is only one person in the band that went on to do that, to actually do that action, and that was Mr. Barrett. So let's go ahead and move on then to John Clare, and I would like to point out a few things about John Clare. Now, I will say quite definitively that I did not know John Clare at all until I started trying to put together this series, and I don't know how well known he is in England. Perhaps in English literature courses in England they discuss John Clare quite a bit, but I did not know Mr. John Clare at all. So this has been a very, I guess you could say, it's been a learning experience for me to learn about Mr. Clare, which is a little bit sad because I think actually he's one of the best poets I've ever read. Now, Mr. John Clare was born 13 July 1793, and he passed away in 20 May of 1864. I'll just point out that that's pretty close to Mr. Thoreau as far as a passing date. So about the same time. Of course, countries quite different. Although you would have to say in many ways, both of them seem to have quite a bit of respect for country life, living out in the wild. So let's look at a few of Mr. John Clare's poems. The first poem I will point you to, I have pointed you to before, Address to a Lark, Singing in Winter. We previously mentioned the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8th verse, where he mentions having 20 years packed behind him, which is very similar to the lyric from Pink Floyd's song. Now, the very next verse is also quite interesting. He says, I'm poor enough, there's plenty knows it. Obscure, how dull my scribbling shows it. Then sure 'twas madness to suppose it. What I was at to gain preferment. There I'll close it. So mum for that. Now there are three things in there that kind of jump out at me. The first is that it's mad to want to try to gain preferment. In other words, to move up in social station is a kind of a madness. And I think Thoreau would definitely agree with that. That drive simply to try to gain preferment or acceptance from other people. I want to point out the use of the word obscure, of course. The word choice obscure is interesting. There was Obscured by Clouds as an album. And obscured and obscure are, of course, they're commonly used words, so nothing specific there. But that is a kind of a connection. I will point out the word scribbling, though. And the reason is because in the album Dark Side of the Moon, the song Time mentions a half page of scribbled lines. And just the verse before, of course, were the 20 years packed behind. So there's another possible connection to John Clare in the Dark Side of the Moon album. The next poem that I'll point you to is called Evening. And fourth verse. Yet thoughtless that he wronged the clown, by blows he'll not be driven, but buzzes on till battered down for unmeant injury given. Now from each hedgerow fearless peep the slowly pacing snails, betraying their meandering creep in silver slimy trails. And of course, quite a bit of this song or this poem, Evening, is about the evening, and I would just like to point out the use of the word silver there for the evening, which is very common because of moonshine, or the shining of the moon. Mr. Clare does quite frequently write of colors, and specifically of evening and night colors as being silver. Sorry, I'm kind of losing my voice. The next poem I'll point you to is called The Fountain, and that's because of the very first lines of it. Her dusky mantle Eve being short for evening, her dusky mantle Eve had spread, the west sky glowered with copper red. So there's a variation of red, which we have already discussed is something that Mr. Barrett likes to do, and apparently Mr. Clare also likes to do. He does have other poems that use variations of red. And not only as nouns, I might say, he also, for some reason, uses the color red in verb form as well, by saying that things are crimsoned, etc. So the next poem I'll point you to is a poem called Noon. This one's just funny because the very first two lines, or even the very first line, all how silent and how still, which is remarkably similar to the song Oh So Quiet by Bjork, where she says it's oh so quiet, it's oh so still. Also, this poem is all how silent and how still. Just a random thought there. Let's look at the next poem then. This is titled The Contrast of Beauty and Virtue. Beauty's a transitory joy, but virtue's sweets shall never cloy. This is the very first verse. As o'er the gay pasture went rocking a clown, a gay gouty buttercup's golden-fringed gown engaged his attention as passing her by, and rudely to gain her he stooped adown. Its beauty so dazzled his eye. So, in that sense there, perhaps being a clown, which is similar to the idea that we previously discussed of clowns being references to rural folk, rustic people. Very similar idea expressed there. And of course, when we mentioned it previously, that was within Shakespeare. Here it's being used by Clare in the same way. The next poem that I will point you to is titled Summer Morning. And this is a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So the seventh verse: "'Tis sweet to meet the morning breeze, or list the giggling of the brook, or stretch beneath the shade of trees, peruse and pause on nature's book." The next verse, which would I guess be the ninth. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Yes, the ninth. "Now let me tread the meadow paths, while glittering dew the ground illumes, as sprinkled o'er the withering swaths their moisture shrinks in sweet perfumes." And that's 9, so 10, 11th. "First sunbeam calling night away, to see how sweet thy summons seems, split by the willow's wavy gray, and sweetly dancing on the streams." I'll just point out the use of certain combinations here that are very similar to a song like Grantchester Meadows and In a Churchyard by the River, etc. Here's the idea of a giggling brook or a laughing brook, the glittering dew on the ground, which also was previously used in a Syd Barrett song. And The willows wavy gray on a stream, which is very similar in feel to the song See Emily Play when it's discussing the willows and the stream. The next poem I'll discuss is entitled On Youth. The first 4 lines: Ah, youth's sweet joys, why are ye gone astray? Fain would I follow, could I find a plan. To my great loss are ye exchanged away, for that sad sorrow ripening name, a man. In other words, the loss of youth in becoming a man, and the corresponding loss of joy. This will become important later on when we discuss the movie Wizard of Oz. The next poem that I will point you to is entitled Upon the Plain, and it is the very last verse. She meets his view, sweet peace adieu, and pleasures known before. He sighs, approves, admires, and loves. His heart's his own no more. This sense of loss and loss of youth, loss of innocence, and being trapped within the love of another is discussed also by Blake in his poem Crystal Cabinet, which we will discuss later. There's another poem entitled The River Gwash, where winding Gwash rolls round its wildest scene. On this romantic bend I sit me down. On that side view the meadows smoothing green, edged with the peeping hamlet's checkering brown. Notice there the very strange uses of things like checkering brown and smoothing green. Modifiers to words that are not fit, but in this way John Clare shows that he has developed his own language, his own metaphors, and much like Shakespeare, he's showing an ability with a tool, which is language, which most people never accomplish. The last poem I will point you to is entitled To Religion. Thou sacred light that right from wrong discerns, thou safeguard of the soul, thou heaven on earth, thou undervaluer of the world's concerns, thou disregarder of its joys and mirth, thou only home the houseless wanderers have, thou prop by which the pilgrim's woes are borne, thou solace of the lonely hermit's cave, etc. You can read on about that, but in this way you can see from the words that are used that religion is disregarding the world's joys and mirths and undervaluing the world's concerns, that there is a disconnect to religion within a person who apparently expects to have more from religion than they are receiving. So a devout person perhaps, but not an overly religious person, Mr. John Clare. Apparently he believes more in nature, very similar to Mr. Thoreau. So we're kind of picking up on a few things here. People that have a connection to nature, that want to live lives in a solitary fashion, and that have a great sense of love and also can feel trapped by that sense of love. So the last person that I want to discuss is William Blake. Now, he was born in November 1757 and died or passed in 12 August of 1827. And Mr. Blake is going to be extremely difficult to discuss because he is a very strange person, in my opinion. He is a devoutly religious person. I guess I should say he's a devoutly spiritual person. What his religious affiliation might be, I do not know. It is very difficult to discern Mr. Blake's religion, but we'll move on. So let's go ahead and take a look at the Crystal Cabinet by Mr. William Blake. This is, of course, supposedly one of the inspirations to the song Crystal Ship by Jim Morrison, and I did a video for that. If you'd like to check it out, you can. The maiden caught me in the wild when I was where I was dancing merrily. She put me into her cabinet and locked me up with a golden key. This cabinet is formed of gold and pearl and crystal shining bright, and within it opens into a world and a little lovely moony night. Another England there I saw, another London with its tower, another Thames and other hills, and another pleasant Surrey bower. Another maiden like herself, translucent, lovely, shining clear, threefold each and the other closed. Oh, what a pleasant, trembling fear! Oh, what a smile, a threefold smile, filled me, that like a flame I burned. I bent to kiss the lovely maid, and found a threefold kiss returned. I strove to seize the inmost form with ardor fierce in hands of flame, but burst the crystal cabinet, and like a weeping babe became a weeping babe upon the wild, and weeping woman pale reclined, and in the outward air again I filled with woes the passing wind. So this idea of being trapped within, I guess you could say, trapped by the love of a woman, recognizing that you're trapped by that love, and perhaps struggling with it in some way, is expressed within that poem. So I guess I would like to discuss some of Mr. Blake's ideas about his interpretation of religion, which is really touchy, and again, it's always kind of touchy to try and discuss what other people think, because you're gonna kind of mess it up. So what I will do is I will just relay the All Religions Are One discourse that he has, and he has 7 principles, and then I guess I'll read these to you, and then I'll discuss, I suspect, just the last one. Principle 1, that the poetic genius is the true man, and that the body or outward form of man is derived from the poetic genius. Likewise, that the forms of all things are derived from their genius, which by the ancients was called an angel and spirit and demon. Principle 2, as all men are alike in outward form, so and with the same infinite variety, all are alike in the poetic genius. So he's relaying the idea that everyone has a poetic genius. Everyone has this ability, this inward thing, and that the outward body of man is kind of derived from whatever is within them. I suppose it's an interesting idea. And that all men are kind of derived in the same way, and they all have a form of poetic genius. Principle 3, no man can think, write, or speak from his heart, but he must intend truth. And that's a capital T, truth. Thus, all sects of philosophy are from the poetic genius, adapted to the weaknesses of every individual. Principle 4, as none by traveling over known lands can find out the unknown, so from already acquired knowledge man could not acquire more, therefore an universal poetic genius exists. And this idea, I suppose, is somewhat discussed by Carl Jung when he discusses the idea of shared metaphor and shared kind of, I don't know what you would call it. If I can find that word out, I'll throw it here. Principle 5, the religions of all nations are derived from each nation's different reception of the poetic genius, which is everywhere called the spirit of prophecy. Principle 6, the Jewish and Christian testaments are an original derivation from the poetic genius. This is necessary from the confined nature of bodily sensation. What all he means there, I don't know exactly. And again, these are just his opinions. I will say, as a matter of historic debate, that the Jewish and Christian testaments, specifically the Jewish Testament, as an original derivation, I don't know now that you could say that even. I think there's enough ties for certain things within the Old Testament that are tied to older stories from from like the Tales of Gilgamesh that I guess you could say it's through that still poetic genius. I don't know. Anyway, principle 7. As all men are alike, though infinitely various, so all religions, and as all similars have one source, the true man is the source, he being the poetic genius. Okay, so there, now that isn't necessarily applicable to me. The reason I want to read that to you is because I think it relays the mindset of Mr. William Blake. And that is that he is trying to attain a form of prophecy tied to poetic genius. In other words, a certain form of creativity, and in that way attain something larger than himself. And perhaps in that way also he is defining the things within the existing church that he does not like, because in many ways he was dissatisfied with the church, and he did a number of, or he wrote a number of poems kind of discussing that. And I did a song for at least one of them, the Chapel All of Gold. So that specific poem relays kind of his idea of, well, it's written in metaphor as well, so it's written about more than one thing. But Mr. Blake struggles with quite a few ideas at the same time. So not least of which is the nature of sexuality and whether or not that's a positive or a negative thing. And of course, he's born in a very repressive time and dealing with all of that repression and perhaps rebelling against it at the same time. So at any rate, I won't go into the secondary meanings of Chapel All of Gold. You can listen to the song, I'll link it. And you can read about the secondary meanings of Chapel All of Gold if you so desire. So the next poem that I would like to discuss is called To the Evening Star. And that is as follows. Thou fair-haired angel of the evening, now whilst the sun rests on the mountains, light thy bright torch of love, thy radiant crown put on, and smile upon our evening bed, smile on our loves, and while thou drawest the blue curtains of the sky, scatter thy silver dew on every flower that shuts its eyes in timely sleep. So there again is the idea of silver dew, of scattering silver. And I'll just remind you of Mr. Barrett's lyrics about the scarlet eagle shining silver on the people. And that this idea of silver dew and blue curtains of the sky feels quite similar to a number of things that Mr. Barrett has written. He has a poem called Mad Song, The Wild Winds Weep. And it goes like this. The wild winds weep, and the night is a cold. Come hither, sleep in my griefs enfold. But lo, the morning peeps over the eastern steeps, and the rustling beds of dawn the earth do scorn. I'll point to, I suppose, two more poems by Mr. Blake. One is called Proverbs of Hell, a wonderful title. Prisons are built with stones of law, brothels with bricks of religion. The pride of the peacock is the glory of God. The lust of the goat is the bounty of God. The wrath of the lion is the wisdom of God. The nakedness of woman is the work of God. So here he's kind of outlining, I suppose, his own belief set and juxtaposing that against what his considerations of religion were at the time. It's all, I guess you could say, filled with a bit of unhappiness, and I suppose you could say a little bit of disrespect, but perhaps that's understandable. At any rate, you can see that this is all written by someone who's struggling with religion, attempting to define their own form of religion in a way. And I'll sum that all up with a last kind of a quote here when he's discussing the nature of what he believes to be the very specific important thing about Jesus. This is from a writing entitled A Memorable Fancy, and the third to last paragraph. The devil answered, Bray a fool in a mortar with a wheat, yet shall not his folly be beaten out of him. If Jesus Christ is the greatest man, you ought to love him in the greatest degree. Now hear how he has given his sanction to the law of 10 commandments. Did he not mock at the Sabbath, and so mock the Sabbath's God? Murder those who were murdered because of him. Turn away the law from the woman taken in adultery. Steal the labor of others to support him. Bear false witness when he omitted making a defense before Pilate. Covet when he prayed for his disciples, and when he bid them shake off the dust of their feet against such as refused to lodge them. I tell you, no virtue can exist without breaking these 10 commandments. Jesus was all virtue and acted from impulse, not from rules. So, in this way, Mr. Blake appears to be relaying the idea that that his interpretation of Jesus is someone who is willing to break rules in the understanding of what is actually virtue and is acting upon the idea of virtue. And there's a whole bunch of, I guess, you could say, arguments that could be had in certain ways. And the next line, I suppose, is a little bit revealing about this. So let's look at the next line, same poem. When he had so spoken, I beheld the angel who stretched out his arms, embracing the flame of fire, and he was consumed and arose as Elijah. Okay, so there's some kind of reference there that I don't totally get. Now, this flame reference I've seen before. The idea of tongues of flame, I believe, are referenced in Virgil's, or in Dante's Inferno by Virgil, and it's like the 8th circle of hell or something like that. The idea that people are being held in flame. And I also will point out, of course, that it's possible that Matthew 3:11 mentions people being baptized in fire. John the Baptist mentions that, and Acts 2:3 mentions the Pentecostal fire. So what form of fire exactly is, or what form of flame or fire is being referenced there by Mr. Blake, I do not know. It could be taken as positive or negative. I guess you'll have to decide on your own. I have my own opinions, but I don't really want to get into it too much. I will end my discussion on Mr. Blake and the possibilities of what some of his meanings might be with a discussion on the Ancient of Days in Europe, which I'm showing on the screen now. So this particular work of art, I think you'll notice if you turn it to the right here, shows something quite similar to the idea of light passing through a pyramid and taking many different colors. Now, in Mr. Blake's version of it, it's actually the ancient kind of measuring out things with a compass. It's not really a rays of light, but it is a pyramid form. And I would like to point out that he's sitting in the sun while he's kind of measuring these things out. So light is passing through him, perhaps, and going through this pyramid shape. Now, again, as we had in the previous video, we discussed Alan Parsons and how... was it Alan Parsons? No, it was a discussion by Storm Thurgeson. And he mentioned seeing the lyrics and having kind of a religious feel for it, and thinking that the idea of light passing through a prism, coming into all these different colors, could possibly capture this idea. And I will point out, of course, that this particular layout of a drawing is quite similar to Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel painting, and that is the creation of man, and shows God touching Adam and giving him the spark of life, or the flame of life, the spark or flame of life. I would like you to notice that in the Michelangelo painting, God is white, or white light there, and is backed by what many people consider to be a human brain that's all in red, which is a cape of some sort, or appears to be a cape of some sort, all in red. So here again you have the idea of a red connection to God, the spark of life being passed to Adam. And notice that the colors behind Adam here are earthly colors: blue, brown, green, etc. So the many colors of the world, which is of course the same idea that's captured by the graphic design of light passing through a prism. And of course, as a metaphor, this could represent not only the idea of the spark of life changing into the many colors of the earth, but also the idea of the spark of light passing to many men, the many various nations of men, the many various colors of humanity, and in a certain way, I suppose you could say, tying all of humanity together, so that, as we mentioned within the John Donne poem, we all hear the bell, and you shouldn't ask who the bell is for, because in a way it is for you. We're all tied together through experience, and the song Us and Them definitely seems to be relaying that. So what is a person supposed to do? How is a person supposed to kind of figure out what it is that life is all about once they realize that there's something more to life than chasing after things that expire in this world? And if they're going to try and live a more meaningful life, how are they going to do that? I really don't know. I mean, I struggle with that as well. I would just like to point out that other people have as well. People like Thoreau. Other people seem to be struggling with the idea of spirituality and religion, like Blake. Other people have tended to find aspects of it in nature, like Mr. Clare. And, of course, we each have to find our own way, and in many ways define what is meaningful for our own existences. And perhaps that's what the beauty of Dark Side of the Moon is really all about. And perhaps that explains the kind of conflict and the idea of madness that's tied into the very end of the album. Each one of these people you could identify as mad, and often were identified as a little bit insane by their peers in their time. They were all acting out of step with the rest of society. John Donne specifically was secretly married in 1601 and was, I believe, he was jailed for because he wasn't supposed to marry the woman that he fell in love with and wanted to marry. But each one of these men has lived a life that is, I guess you could say, kind of on the outskirts of what is considered to be acceptable, and has defined their own existences and what is important to them. And perhaps that's what all people should be doing. And that's what's relayed within this album. And if we are able to do that and have meaningful lives, perhaps then we can actually feel a connection with one another. I will finish with one last idea, and I kind of let this one go, and that's just to give you kind of an aha moment to finish off this episode. Okay? So, the Ancient of Days, as we mentioned, is by Mr. William Blake, and could be an inspiration for the symbol of the prism and the dividing light, which could represent people, or I don't know, a spark of life being passed to the earth. I don't know. But Mr. Blake not only made these paintings, he also would develop poems and ideas and prophecies and poetic writings for each one of these as he did them. And for a prophecy, he has written words. I will just read you the first verse. Okay? So let's have some fun. I'm going to blow your mind right now. We mentioned the connection to this in Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel and the connection perhaps to the album cover and the design. So here are the words behind the painting by Mr. William Blake, A Prophecy. The deep of winter came. That's the first line. The deep of winter came. There's a reference to winter. Second line. What time the secret child. There's a secret child reference. We've already made that connection before as well. The third line. Descended through the orient gates of the eternal day. War ceased, and all the troops like shadows fled to their abodes. Then Enitharmon saw her sons and daughters rise around. Like pearly clouds, they meet together in the crystal house. We've already mentioned Dolly Rocker and Pearl. There's a reference to Pearly. There's a reference to Crystal House, which we've discussed already as one of Mr. Blake's poems. And Lost, possessor of the moon, joyed in the peaceful night, thus speaking while his numerous sons shook their bright fiery wings. A very interesting verse. Quite a few references there that perhaps tie in with things within Pink Floyd songs and Syd Barrett songs. You'll have to decide that on your own. At any rate, hopefully I didn't go on too long and kept your attention, and hopefully you enjoyed this episode. The next episode will be about Dark Side of Oz, and we'll discuss, or we'll try to look at Dark Side of Oz through metaphor, since it's very easy, and most people do, just look at the literal relations between the lyrics and things that are happening and the scenes of Wizard of Oz. We will just be looking, we'll look at that, but we'll also be looking at things metaphorically as much as we're able to do. So that's all for now. I'll talk to you folks later.